people in academia would find questionable as opposed to those outside of it, and really has a kind of broader audience. So back around the turn of the century, back around 2000, I love to be able to say that, I was working on another book. I was working on The Secret World of Sidney Riley, which was another book about spies and revolving largely around things that happened before, during, and after the First World War. So the guy I was interested in that book, Sidney Riley, was running around New York during World War I, involved in all kinds of intrigues and shenanigans. And one of the things that I knew, sort of in the back of my mind, was that Aleister Crowley was there as well. And I also knew that Crowley, at various times later on in the 20s and the 30s, had claimed periodically, was inclined to tell people that during the war, that is the First War, that he spent almost entirely in the United States, that he had been there doing work for His Majesty's government. And the very strong implication that Crowley had when he would name names, and he did name a few names, was that this connection was mostly with British naval intelligence. This is something maybe I'll elaborate a bit later on. When people think of British intelligence, you tend to think of it if it's one institution, which it's not. It's one of those things that's a house with many rooms. So the British Admiralty had an intelligence system. You had what we call MI6, but which was really a thing called the Secret Intelligence Service. It's really the SIS. That's what James Bond, if he was a real person, would work for. That handles foreign intelligence, so sort of the version of the CIA. And then you have MI5, the Security Service, which is roughly the British equivalent of the FBI. It's a counterintelligence service. And then Scotland Yard, the Metropolitan Police, which is basically a criminal police, also has special branch and other elements that coordinate with these. For a very brief period of time, the RAF had its own intelligence branch as well. So there are a number of different agencies. And one of the interesting things about when you have different agencies is that it is by no means the case that one agency knows what the other agency is doing.
They're all
in fact,
they're all very territorial. Yeah,
they're territorial, and it's also a principle of something called compartmentalization.
Mm-hmm.
And compartmentalization is just part of, the thing that all intelligence agencies are involved in, really, is an information game.
Mm-hmm.
And they function to acquire secrets or information, and they function sometimes simultaneously to protect information. So one of the ways that you protect information is that you have as few people in on it as possible. It's the old concept of need to know. And so in compartmentalizing things, it means that even within the same agency, for instance, not everybody knows everything. I mean, the last thing that you want to have is to have someone sitting around with a list of every agent you have in the world. That's virtually suicidal, especially the age of hacking. So you break things up. The people who really know, the officers, the sort of paid civil servants who are full-time employees of intelligence agencies, who manage assets, which is essentially what Crowley was. He's not an intelligence officer. He was an asset who managed people. They're pretty much the ones who ought to know who those are, and that information isn't shared with everybody. Therefore, one of the things that happened, and by the way, it happened with Crowley, is that one hand of intelligence sees him as a traitor and a threat, while another is in fact it has him in their employ and wants him seen as a traitor and a threat. I mean, that works perfectly for them.
Yeah.
And it's one of those kind of odd things that you find, that an agency or an officer within that agency will deliberately play his assets as if they're working for the other side, because that's the people you're trying to fool. And that gives you an idea as to what his function would be. So I was working on this book on Riley, and I got curious. I thought, well, Crowley and Riley were kind of running around, and they both, Riley had connections to British intelligence, and Crowley claimed, I don't know, maybe I'll check that out. This is one of the things. I guess it's a kind of standard research procedure that I use, since most of the people that I tend to research are kind of pathological liars. You can't trust anything they say. And therefore, you have to go through this whole kind of process of triangulation, of finding out who they're connected.
Und das ist der entscheidende Punkt. In dieser Szene, wo jeder ein Lügner ist, musst du Triangulation, du musst Querverweise, du musst bestimmte Dinge checken. Beispiel. Es gab die Mudflood in England. Na, guck doch mal, ob es zur selben Zeit beim Wetterdienst auch Bestätigungen für eine oder nicht. Ja, man kann alles überprüfen. Jeden einzelnen Scheiß, wenn man das will. Herr Knopfloch.
With. So I'm always very interested anytime the subject of my research meets someone or goes into business with someone, or I don't know, uses the same public restroom within a 15-minute interval, whatever. It's the type of thing of checking for those connections. And a lot of times they don't pan out to be anything. It's a casual relationship. It's nothing of any particular significance. Other times they're not. But it's one of those things you have to look at very closely. So that's why I was curious. It was just pure curiosity. It was off the subject I was working on. So I thought, well, where could I find that out? Well, one of the things that I've been making a good deal of use of was one of the few troves of intelligence material that has been declassified. And here again is one of those things I point out to your listeners, those who want to be budding spy researchers or to go into this type of thing, is that if you are interested in researching anything to do with modern espionage or intelligence, the first brick wall you're going to hit is that almost universally intelligence records are exempted from any kind of Freedom of Information Act. Does not happen. And agencies are under no obligation to share anything with you. And generally speaking, they're not interested in doing that. And they'll make that very plain. On the other hand, sometimes it's useful to them to share things with you, which, creates this kind of question that, I don't know, since MI6 just gave me access to this dossier, does that just mean they're being nice today? Or does it mean that they have some other reason? Of course, they have some other reason for doing it. The reason for doing that, by the way, is because they will almost always come along with the idea that they get to see whatever it is that you write before you publish it. Which means what they're really interested in is that they're curious about what you know or you might find out, and their way of getting pre-publication review of that is to be helpful. So, unselfish acts. So, I wrote off to the National Archives in Washington. And what I wrote off to get access to was a thing called the Records of the Military Intelligence Division. Now, today when we talk about American intelligence, we may talk about the FBI, the CIA, the DIA, the NSA, but nobody talks about the MID because it's basically a defunct institution. It got absorbed into what's later the Defense Intelligence Agency. But back in World War I, when the U.S. entered the First World War in 1917, we were, it was a simpler time. And one of the things that we really didn't have was much in the way of any kind of intelligence agency. So we had to kind of cobble them together. So it's during World War I, for instance, that this thing called the Bureau of Investigation, later the FBI, before it became the FBI, was really sort of turned partly for that purpose, but it wasn't big enough to handle the volume. And so the Army's intelligence section, basically G2, was built up into a thing called the Military Intelligence Division, or MID, and they just started keeping track of everybody, of any kind of security threat, pro-Germans, anything seditious. I mean, once Congress passed the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act, there was a field day to investigate things. Now, what happened is when that agency sort of, eventually went out of business or subsumed, all of its old, huge 3x5 card files were all digitized and ended up in the National Archives, and you can go and look through them. Now, not all the files are there, but at least there are generally references to what was there, but most of them are. So I knew that for the World War I period, this was the trove. If Americans, if there was any American agency that would have investigated Crowley, it was the MID, and I knew that if they did, there would be a file, right? Well, sure enough, there was a file. It wasn't a very big file. It's, I don't know, maybe 30 pages long. Like most files, it's largely full of stuff that isn't very interesting. But there was one report from the headquarters of the United States Military Academy at West Point, where there was a little branch of the MID operated. And what had happened is that there was a military intelligence officer there, and he had become interested in Aleister Crowley because in the summer of 1918, Crowley was camping out, this is in the book, he goes and he camps out on this island in the Hudson River, not far from West Point. Now, Crowley had all sorts of supposed esoteric reasons for doing that, but you got this weird Englishman camping out on an island in the river, and that attracted their attention. So they began looking into him, and they found.
Also, nochmal übersetzt für die das Englisch vielleicht nicht ganz so gut verstehen. Es gibt eine Akte über Aleister Crowley von der Navy Academy, weil er in der Nähe der Academy auf dem Fluss dort gecampt hat. Und da sind sie aufmerksam auf ihn geworden. Auf diesen verrückten britischen Mann. 1918 war Amerika kurz davor, in den Krieg einzusteigen. Was machte Aleister Crowley kurz vor Kriegseintritt? Die Zionisten sagten, wir bringen Amerika an Bord. Aleister Crowley, kleine Kinder, Heroin und Mescalin. In New York, Hudson River. Müsste glaube ich dort sein, wenn ich das nicht irre. Was könnte jemand, der mit kleinen Kindern Liebe macht und Sex Magic mit kleinen Kindern macht und Heroin und Drogen und alles mit kleinen Kindern, was könnte der 1918 in New York für einen Auftrag gehabt haben? Denn er kam mit der Lusitania von Liverpool nach New York. Auf der Rückfahrt ging das Schiff unter.
To their horror, that this same Crowley had been connected up until very recently with a pro-German magazine, a magazine called, wait for it, The Fatherland.
Die Zeitung Das Vaterland, eine auf Deutsch produzierte Zeitung, geschrieben von Aleister Crowley, in der Zeppeline London niederbrennen. Zum Wohle Churchills. Ohne dass ein Deutscher wusste, was Aleister Crowley dort in Amerika schrieb.
I think if I was going to
Um das schon mal vorwegzunehmen, er tat das nur, um einen Iren davon zu überzeugen, dass er ein deutscher Nationalist ist. Und mit den Iren einen Deal zu machen, um die Iren zu finanzieren über Waffendeals, damit die Iren gegen England losschlagen, damit Churchill gegen die Iren losmachen kann.
a pro-German magazine, I don't know what more giveaway title I could come up with, but yes, he had written anti-British articles for the Fatherland. I mean, this guy appeared to be a German propagandist, exactly the kind of guy they wanted to round up, except, he was a British subject. So, what did the MID do? Before they grabbed him, they inquired with the British consulate in New York. They ought to know something, right? And they did. So here is this really just a couple of sentences that was, what I really wasn't expecting to find, but here it was. And so in answer to the MID's inquiry, it was determined that Aleister Crowley was an employee of the British government, but at present in this country on official business of which the British consul New York City has full cognizance.
Er war ein Angestellter der Krone, um es kurz zu fassen. Ja, ein Angestellter der britischen Krone im Geheimauftrag zum Wohle der Krone. Deswegen ist ja auch Betty White und Barbara Bush so spannend.
It continued to say that the British government was fully aware of the fact that Crowley was connected with German propaganda and had received money for writing anti-British articles. The British made it very clear that they didn't have a problem with this, and they didn't want the Americans to do anything like arrest him. So they didn't. So what was important about that couple of sentences? Well, it meant that when Crowley later said that he was working for the British government, here was the British government in 1818 saying that, yes, he did. So that led to a little article for this academic journal.
Und das Problem bei Aleister Crowley ist, alle sagen entweder, er ist der Teufel, weil sie christlich geprägt sind, oder er ist der Messias, weil sie total vernarrt in ihn sind. Es gibt keine objektive Betrachtung von Aleister Crowley bis zu diesem Buch, weil einer, der Geheimdienst-Fan ist, ihn während der Geheimdienstarbeit entdeckte. Und ein Geheimdienstmann, der mit Tricks und allem ausgestattet ist und sich damit auskennt, hat Aleister Crowley analysiert. Dieses Buch ist mehr wert als Gold, denn es zeigt zum ersten Mal den wahren Aleister Crowley, wo du nie weißt, ob er jetzt gerade lügt oder nicht. Ein Geheimdienstmann geht immer davon aus, dass es gelogen ist. Wenn er die Wahrheit sagt, dann nur, weil er dich leiten will. Also, weiter zuhören.
Intelligence and intelligence and counterintelligence. And it wasn't very long, but basically the gist of the article was to say that, hey, look what I found. Aleister Crowley and
und zu dem Ding, dass alle Frauen ein Mann gewesen sein sollen. Ihr macht euch lächerlich damit. Ist mal ganz im Ernst. Bei all denen, die sagen, das ist Mann, obwohl es eine Frau ist. Wie war es hier? Sean Connery soll auch eine Frau sein. Ihr macht alle unglaubwürdig. Es gibt sowas. Aber sowas gibt es erst seitdem es Schönheits-OPs gibt. Und Schönheits-OPs gibt es noch nicht allzu lange. Höchstens seit den 80ern kam das so in Trend. 70er, 80er, muss man mal gucken. Entscheidend dabei ist, nicht jeder Mann ist eine Frau und nicht jede Frau ist ein Mann. Die sind schon Mann und Frau. Trotzdem böse. Also hört auf, zu viel überall rein zu interpretieren, weil ihr macht die ganze Szene unglaubwürdig.
An eccentric English figure who claimed on and off to work for British intelligence. Well, guess what? According to this MID report, he did. Now, that was simply the discovery that Crowley wasn't lying when he had claimed to do it. Now, of course, it left a lot of big questions. For instance, like what exactly what he was doing. When they say that Aleister Crowley was in the employ of the British government and in this country on official business, well, what official business? What was he doing? Now, I didn't really want to go any further with it at the time because remember, I was working on another book. So I thought this was interesting. I wrote a little article, got that article published, and sort of checked that off the list. And I really wasn't going to think much more about it. In fact, I didn't have any intention of carrying it further. But then, you discover one of those things. And that was that Aleister Crowley, while, I don't think a household name, is nevertheless known to a lot of people. And people have opinions about him and know things about him or think they know things about him. So I started getting something that you almost never get to.
Und er sagt am Anfang des ganzen Gespräches, wenn du willst, dass jemand es niemals liest, dann veröffentliche es in einem wissenschaftlichen Zeitung. Dann liest es definitiv niemand. Bei diesem Artikel war es anders.
An academic article, I started getting replies. And I started getting little bits of information. And I started getting people popping up going, well, are you going to expand on this? Are you going to tell us more? You should write a book. You should write a book. You should write a book. And since I was writing another one, I didn't pay much attention to it at the time. But to cut to the chase, a few years later, I had another project, which, by the way, I put aside and have never gotten back to.
Und ich denke mal, ich werde versuchen, Andreas, wenn er dann mit dem Scheiße, nach hier der FBI War on Tupac Shakur kommt, der glaube ich, der Aquarian Conspiracy, das liegt schon fertig da. Aber danach tippe ich mal, ja, ich mal ein gutes Wort einlegen, dass man dieses Buch als nächstes. Weil von Hitlers 50. Geburtstag über die OTO auf deutschem Boden, über den Marsch auf Rom mit Mussolini, über die Lusitania. Wer hat die New Age erfunden? Wer hat Spirit in der westlichen Welt verbreitet? Es war alles Aleister Crowley. Alle Hippies, wo ich sage, ihr seid verwirrt, ihr seid an Lucifers Eiern. Die folgen Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley war ein Preacher. Er war ein Priester seiner eigenen Religion, die genau das Gegenteil ist von dem, was sein Vater machte. Denn Aleister Crowley hatte Papa-Probleme. Ja, er hatte Papi-Probleme. Sein Papa war ein Priester, aber eher katholisch. Und er war auch Priester, aber eher genau andersrum.
And I was convinced, simply because of the amount of interest that original article had created, that, okay, I'll do further research on this. I'll see if I can figure out what this official business was. I'll dig into it deeper and I'll see what I can find. And, and frankly, to begin with, I wasn't sure I was going to come up with much. I thought this whole thing would, bottom out pretty quickly, but it didn't. The more you dug, the more you found, and the more places you found to dig, and the more you would find there. And it eventually developed that what I came up with was that this Crowley's involvement with British intelligence wasn't something.
Okay, we're back. We're cut off. Sorry about that. Okay, so where were we?
Well, after deciding I was going to, looking at the possibility of writing a book, guess what? About a year later, I ended up with a book. So there it was. There turned out to be plenty after all, and I think it's one of the things that may be repeating myself a bit, that I've continued to find more. I think it's one of those things that, in some way it's Aleister Crowley is a cornucopia that never stops giving. It's one of those things that people still have interest in. Hands down, of all the things that I've written in my entire career, the Secret Agent 666 book and the article that preceded it have gotten more attention than everything else put together.
Led Zeppelin and Ozzy Osbourne?
Down to the Beatles, the entire 60s counterculture, which I suspect Crowley probably would have just hated. But nevertheless, that certainly made him a character. It's one of those things, I guess, that I said at the beginning that when I entered into this, I didn't enter into it as a Thelemite. Okay, I wasn't particularly interested in I'm not disinterested in the spiritual or metaphysical aspects of it. I mean, it's one of those things that, I get asked a lot, because one of the areas that I study along with intelligence is, what could be called occultism. I mean, I've taught a course on occultism, so people there naturally figure that I must be an occultist, somewhere I've got an art or, an altar and a black robe or something. And I don't, really. And if I did, I wouldn't tell you. But the thing about it, I guess the question is why am I interested in something like this? If I'm not a Thelemite, if I'm not interested in it out of a keen interest into metaphysical inquiry, and I guess part of it is that I'm just nosy. That's one of the things that's what historians do. We constantly prowl through the garbage of dead people, trying to come up with things that we think other people would be interested in. It's really just sort of, I am not a follower, but I will admit that I found Crowley an intriguing figure before I wrote the book, and when it was done, I found him an even more intriguing figure. And by intriguing, I don't necessarily mean likable or agreeable. I mean, if you form an opinion, one of the things that I've written, the book on Riley was essentially a biographical study. It focused around a person. The first book I ever wrote on someone that nobody's ever heard of, probably, a Russian revolutionary named Boris Savinkov. Same type of thing. I was trying to sort of resurrect this person's historical career, and you nevertheless you can't spend a lot of time with a person. You can't go through their personal writings. You can't look through their diaries, for instance. You can't look at all the opinions that other people have about them, and not ultimately begin to form some kind of opinion of your own. And usually I find that goes through sort of three sort of periods. And initially, when you enter into writing something that's kind of biographical, whether it would be an Aleister Crowley or Sidney Riley or whoever, you come into it with already some kind of image as to who this person is. And that image generally doesn't hold up very long under closer scrutiny. You very quickly find out that there's a lot more, occasionally a lot less to this person than you would have assumed. And so your view begins to change. And your view is inevitably sort of affected by the material that comes in, and no matter how hard you strive, you have to maintain an objectivity, but you have to realize that you're being influenced by this. So the view generally changes from a kind of naive perception as to who this person was to one that almost inevitably becomes increasingly critical. Because, whenever you look at anyone's life closely, if you examine your own closely, one of the things you tend to see are a lot of the faults and the blemishes. And, you see the mistakes that people made. And it's probably in Crowley's case or anybody else's, nobody's life ever quite turns out the way that they expected that it would. They never quite turn out being the person maybe that they expected to be. And so it's easy to go from this state of kind of naive perception of the person to one that really just seems to have a lower opinion of them. But I found that in the case with Aleister Crowley, as with Riley and others, but by the time I got to the end of the process, though, there was another sort of stage. And that's the stage where you sort of put all of this stuff together. And one of the things I think you realize is that despite everything that you've learned about this person, all the stuff that you know now that you didn't know at the beginning of the process, one of the things you realize is you still don't know this person totally. In fact, in some ways, they're more mysterious than they were previously. And it has to do largely with the amount of contradictions. And Crowley is a tremendously contradictory person. Contradictory in the sense that I think a good deal of the time he says things for effect, whether it's meant to be comic effect or whether it's meant to be dramatic effect. And so one of the questions becomes, do you take him seriously when he says that? I mean, is this some kind of a very sort of dry joke that he's making, or is it something that he's quite serious about? And the one thing I'd say I did come out of it with is that Crowley, in his own particular way, in his rather dry British style, did have one hell of a sense of humor. He's actually fairly funny on occasion, if you can kind of, catch on to what he's doing. There are comments he makes very interesting. He spent years in the States. He was here from 1914 through almost 5 years. Traveled all around the country. Spent a lot of time in New York, but he visited places like, Hollywood, California, which he didn't like, San Francisco, which he did kind of. Oddly enough, the two cities in the United States that he thought were the only ones that had any real character were New Orleans and San Antonio, Texas. I'm not really sure why. I've been to both of them, but those are the places that he was really, or he was pretending to be impressed by them in some way. Hollywood, he sort of compiled to an overflowing pile of maggots. he was not really impressed by it, and New York was interesting and vibrant, but dirty, and in the summer extraordinarily hot. So he really turned out to be, in some ways, more interesting than I thought of him. But interesting, again, is one of those terms to say something is interesting. In the end, I guess I would agree with one of his writer friends. I think it's Dennis Wheatley, but I could be wrong. He was a British novelist who once said that he kind of liked Crowley, but the two things that he would never do was to lend him money or leave him alone with his children. And I would say that would probably be pretty good advice. And I wouldn't say that because I think that Crowley would actually do anything to the children, but he'd probably come up with some imaginative bedtime stories that you wouldn't necessarily want to have. So it's kind of, for lack of a better term, there's this kind of puckish quality to him. There's a kind of jokester or trickster about him. And that, again, is one of those things that has its connections to intelligence. So it goes all the way back to the question you came up with earlier: how long had he been connected with British intelligence? And I said that in working on the book, it became apparent to me that this was kind of a lifelong connection.
He went to Cambridge, right?
Yes, he went to Cambridge. Didn't graduate, but he went to Cambridge. That was enough of the time. I mean, in his background, here's part of the background. You can find this in any biography on him. I do discuss it in the book, but it's important to keep in mind. The background is that Aleister Crowley, the guy who becomes a kind of, arch occultist or arch so-called Satanist of the 20th century, really grew up in what we would now call a fundamentalist Christian household. His parents.
Kurz festgehalten, die Cambridge Five wurden zu den Five Eyes. Die Cambridge Five waren teilweise kommunistisch, ein Rothschild war mit drin und Aleister Crowley ging nach Cambridge. Wichtig. Denn der MI6 und Crowley über die Bushes dann zur CIA 911 A Million Lights, A Million Stars und NWO-Ansprache.
were staunch members of the Plymouth Brethren, which was one of these kind of, well, Plymouth Brethren view of the world was pretty simple. Everybody but them was going to hell. I think some people out there have probably, my mom's church was kind of like that. We have it right, and everyone else are just all sinners and that they're going to hell. And this was the atmosphere that he grew up in, and both his parents took this very seriously. This created a kind of lifelong conflict with his mother. Okay, not too surprising, Aleister Crowley had mommy issues. But on the other hand, his father was a man. The family's money. That's kind of interesting. Where did they get their money from? From Crowley ales, from brewing. Okay, so essentially the whole family, the larger extended family, had its fortune as brewers. His father, however, had dropped out of the brewing business and had devoted most of his time to being, what a good fundamentalist Christian should do, being a lay preacher. And I think his father, Edward Crowley, who he was basically named after, died when his son was around 11. And that seems to have left a real mark on him. Because in contrast to his mother, I don't know, maybe because he died when he was 11, he idolized his father. I mean, this again is one of these kind of contradictions. Here you have in Aleister Crowley a man who publicly rejected Christianity, not just fundamentalist Christianity, but rejected Christianity and seemingly everything that it stood for, and wanted to create a new spiritual dispensation, thelema that would replace it. Nevertheless, deeply loved and admired his father, who was a fundamentalist Christian pastor. And one of the ways of looking at something that kind of dawned on me, maybe it should have dawned on me early, that if you look at Crowley's career as a kind of spiritual teacher, he's following in his father's footsteps. His father preached the gospel. Aleister preached his own kind of gospel, but he essentially is doing the same thing that his father did. The other thing about Crowley, though, is that there's even this contradiction that goes on in his relationship with Christianity. I mean, it's one of those things that because of his upbringing, you can now understand, he actually understands pretty well. He's not an outsider on this. He is someone who understands the Gospels, who understands the sort of mystical aspects of the faith and the details of it. Of course, as someone once pointed out to me, no one should be able to preach the gospel with greater sincerity than the devil. So the mere fact that Crowley could preach it, but he's very familiar with it, and often as not, he doesn't come off as hostile. It's something, even in some of his associations with people. I don't know how many people, for instance, out there may know the name of another sort of eccentric British character, a guy named Montague Summers. Have you ever run across him?
No.
Okay. Montague Summers is, somebody can go out there and, get his Wikipedia page. There is one out there. Montague Summers was a kind of the contemporary of Crowley. They lived during the same period of time, and they met each other and were, by, at least in the opinion of others, friends. They could sit down. But Montague Summers was a Catholic and Episcopalian or Anglican priest. Okay, he was like in both churches. How did he do that? That's the story. But he was kicked out of the Anglican church, but he was brought into this small branch of the Catholic church. But he was an ordained priest. And therefore, as a priest, a practicing Christian, and a man who, if you look up Montague Summers, just
priesthood was kicked out. Alles geht auf Sabbatai Sevi 1666 zurück und die Bank of England und die Gründung der Bank of England 1666. Aus dieser Schiene entstand Crowley, über die Crowleys zu den Bushes, von den Bushes zu 911 und zu NWO.
SUNMERS. You'll find that he wrote books he wrote books on the history of vampires and werewolves, and also one called the History of Witchcraft and Demonology. All right. So Summers wrote books on occult subjects, but from the standpoint of a kind of churchman's view. So just in case you were wondering, he doesn't have really good things to say about werewolves or vampires or witches. They're, in his view, they're all just as absolutely wicked as they have ever been described to be. But one of the things he did is that he sort of buttressed this. He did go through old accounts, you know, newspapers from Transylvania or whatever, and his books, I ran across them in a county library as a kid. And they're really kind of creepy because they make this stuff sound, you know, at least halfway convincing.
Mm-hmm.
But here again, you get this question about Summers. You know, did he really believe in vampires, or did he just know a kind of, you know, good topic? You know, he was ahead of Twilight by some decades, but nevertheless realized that vampires were going to be big business at some point in the future. And he's also, you know, he's a priest, but he's a defrocked priest. And, you know, it turns out, why was he a defrocked priest? Why had he been kicked out of the Church of England? Want to take any guesses?
Kicked out of the Church of England?
Yeah.
Was he underground Jacobite or something?
No, you can sum it up in one word: choir boys.
Yeah, you
So
don't immediately
yes.
do it. It seems too obvious.
Yes. Oh, yes. You wouldn't. Yeah, it has to be something more mysterious than that, because when. So yes, in fact, Summers was the member of one of the few sort of gay secret societies, whose name is going to escape me at this point, but it was one which functioned the sort of fringes of the British establishment.
Eine Gay Secret Society. Alester Crowley's Sex Magic mit Kindern and a Gay Secret Society. Kommt euch das bekannt vor? It's Epstein style, 1900.
Okay.
And, you know, of course, Crowley, who off and on, you know, passed himself off as being bisexual. I don't know whether that's real or not. So they had something to talk about there. But, you know, so Summers in some ways is really this, not quite what he seems. And yet you would assume that someone, you know, even a defrocked priest who thinks that witchcraft is evil, would then sit down and have an enjoyable tete-a-tete with someone who in many ways was considered to be the leader of modern witchcraft in Britain. Yet they got along well.
Also, der Priester, der aus der Kirche geschmissen wurde, hat kein Problem mit Aleister Crowleys Witchcraft, weil er selber so drauf ist.
Now, the question about that is that they get along because they found enough common denominators to put aside their differences, or was it because that their differences were simply apparent? It comes back to this idea that both of them really could get along with each other because at bottom they didn't really quite believe or advocate the things they publicly appeared to. Now, what makes this all the more interesting is that Summers himself had at least a passing connection to, if not British intelligence, to Italian intelligence, for instance. All right. So one of the things, for instance, so a new bit of information is that if anyone reads the...
Also, Priester, italienischer Geheimdienst, Jesuit, direkt für den Vatikan, direkt zu Aleister Crowley, der mit MI6 in New York versucht, Amerika in den Ersten Weltkrieg zu bringen.
Book, which of course they should. There's a part where we discuss it, and it occurs in the 1930s, and one of the things that's happening is that someone is spying on Crowley in Britain, but they're reporting to him to the Vatican. Okay, there are reports coming from someone, and they're going to this guy, a particular Jesuit in the Vatican, who's very interested in investigating occultism.
Der Vatikan war sehr daran interessiert. Sehr. Kommt euch das heute bekannt vor?
A fellow by the name of Father Joseph Ledit. Well, Ledit isn't terribly important in himself, but the question was, who is this person who is supplying the reports on Crowley? And the only thing we sort of know about them is that they used a code name or a code letter, M. So in the book, I come up with a couple of possibilities for that. One is a fellow by the name of Maxwell Knight, who was someone Crowley knew, was another intelligence officer. So that might have been M. But basically, in piecing together little clues that came in later on, figured out that M is Montague Summers. I mean, once you realize that it's Summers, it makes perfect sense that it's Summers. All of these things, it's like, why didn't I think of that before? So Summers was befriending Crowley, and yet he was also reporting on him. By the way, when Summers died in the late 40s, I think just a little after Crowley did, one of the things that his personal secretary noted was that so-called government men showed up to carry off a lot of his papers. So we can sort of guess who those government men might have been. But you know.
Crowleys Drogentagebuch, his Drug Diary, war die Grundlage für MK Ultra.
Only guess, and what it was they were looking for in his papers.
Operation Artichoke, you know?
So I guess one of the things this immediately touches upon is that if someone like Montague Summers, an author on occult subjects, had some connection to government men, and Crowley had connections to government men, what is it about occultism? What is it about that realm that might attract an intelligence agency? Why would professional spies be interested in this type of thing? Why would they take it seriously? So it goes back to this thing again about information. Your job as a spy, as a professional intelligence officer, is to manage information, to acquire it, often through hostile means, but also through secret means. And to do that, you need access. You need people who know where that information is.
Genau das ist es. Geheimdienste brauchen Leute, die an Orte kommen, wo Geheimdienste nicht hinkommen. Marco Polo war auch Spion. Er berichtete, wie es war. Fahr hin, guck, wie es aussieht und gib uns Bericht. Spion. Alester Crowley kam an Orte, an die nie ein Geheimdienst hinkam. Kleine Kinder, Mescalin, LSD, gab es damals noch nicht, aber ihr wisst, was ich meine. Und das in New York.
You know, basically, you need to get people to talk, or you need to find out who those people would be. So one of the things that it was kind of revealed to me in working on this book, and continues to reveal itself to me and other things I've worked on, is the degree to which the intelligence world and the occult world continually wash over each other. And
Geheimdienst und Okkult leben beide im Geheimen. Ihre Codes kann man kombinieren. Geheimdienste benutzen gerne Maurer, weil Maurer im Codieren schon geschult sind.
part of it simply is that, and I mean, here's a simple explanation of what it is that Crowley offered to anybody in British intelligence. He offered access to social spheres that most other agents or assets couldn't provide. And one of the things about...
Und an der Stelle wird Donald J. Trump wichtig. Bring uns Namen. Donald J. Trumps Auftrag war, wer jetzt mal TV-Star und bring uns Namen.
Occultism, the secret societies that surrounded it, the various esoteric orders, is that they attracted a unusually well-heeled group of people. I mean, you know, one of the things I pretty much figured out was that occultism was not the pastime of the poor. They had folk magic. It wasn't really the pastime of the middle class. It was the pastime. It was the pastime of the upper classes, of people in the nobility, and the upper middle class, and the arts, even in the sciences. So it was something that already tended to attract many people from social elites. And it bound them together in various organizations where they could explore interests in things that publicly might not be as acceptable as they were otherwise. So one of the things you could find is that access to occult information and occult organizations sometimes gave you material that was simply blackmail worthy, right? Get somebody connected, find somebody who was naked at a black mass, and that might be something that you could exploit later on. But the other thing is that there also was simply something in the way in which both organizations operated. That secrecy is tremendously important. within secret societies, within occultism, secrecy is a kind of guiding principle, and the same thing is true within intelligence. So there's a kind of overlap in mentality in some way. There's also a very great emphasis upon, appearing as one thing and being another. The way in which you would obtain information is that you either have to deceive or win the confidence of the people that have that information. And that was something that Crowley could do. So here is how I think it worked in the First World War, and why Crowley became important to the British in New York. Excuse me, there's a dog barking out here. But you want me to hold on for a second?
Is that your dog?
It is. Okay, hold on. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Well, I thought she was. I'm locked in my office, and so there are actually two dogs that were painting outside the door. So that's that, and then one of them will start that to get me to come. So anyway, I think I've locked them out into another room. Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
So there we go. All right. So there's this
a practical use for getting into the occult. These things, getting information, blackmail, human compromise, and these things. Yeah.
And the other thing is that many people on the outside. I mean, most people on the outside of occultism are either frightened of it and will keep their distance, or they are attracted to it and can be manipulated by it in some way. So it's a rather handy thing to use. So I think that Crowley got started in this probably when he was at Cambridge, because one of the things that he was being groomed for, he came from a fairly, again, not a rich family, but a respectable family, respectable enough to get him into Cambridge, which you had to know the right people to do. It wasn't his grades that got him into Cambridge. It was the family connection. And one of the things that he admits is that he was sort of being trained for was the diplomatic service. So at some point, he kind of envisioned that he was going to become a British diplomat. And then he talks about taking a kind of trip to Russia around 1898. Okay. And he never made it there, as I recall, but he was on his way through Scandinavia, and he had some kind of, the best way I could describe it, or that he describes it, is that he had some sort of mystical experience, or he had some sort of life-changing experience. And that seems to have been what sent him off on the trajectory towards his increasing interest in metaphysics and occultism, and turned him away from a diplomatic career. What I think is kind of hiding in this is that Crowley was, even then, when he was in college, had been identified as a young man of adventurous spirit. Keep in mind, among the other things, he was an alpinist. He was a world-class mountaineer. And I think this is one of the things that is often forgotten when people tend to think of, Aleister Crowley, he's that, fat guy that looks like Jabba the Hutt, all right? Except he has arms and legs. Well, towards the end of his life, his physique left, but he was certainly, as a young man, in his 20s and his 30s, he was an athlete. This was a man who, climbed K2 in the Himalayas, one of the first attempts on that, and was very athletic, physically strong, capable. So you combine someone who had physical stamina with someone who would apparent already early on had a kind of flexible morality. Now, someone who wasn't too overly tied to hard definitions of right and wrong. Now, it doesn't take too much imagination to figure out why in spy work, flexible morality might be useful in that case.
We could use a guy like
So,
you.
yeah, it's just, yeah, okay. Now, it's like, I think, again, I quote somewhere in the book that there's another, I don't think it's John le Carré, but someone else who was being, introduced into British intelligence and said, well, the thing you have to do, you have to be able to lie and steal and kill, right? You may have to do those things. You shouldn't do them unless you have to, but you need to be prepared to do it, and you can't be squeamish about it. So in the case of Crowley, I think they could have found someone who wasn't likely to be squeamish about those things.
Yeah. In your book,
Yeah.
you have I have it right here. John Le Carre in a BBC interview talked about why people remained spies and the subtle reward it offers. Le Carre, David Cornwell, had a long career in British intelligence, something long assumed by many of his readers, but only recently acknowledged by the author. He likened his recruitment while a student at Oxford University to a religious awakening. I really believed at last that I had found a cause I could serve. It was as if the whole of my life had prepared me for the moment, he continued. It was like joining the priesthood. It's easy to imagine Crowley saying much the same. Le Carre also added to the equation an inner, somewhat perverse satisfaction in deception and the dignity which great secrecy confers upon you.
Yeah.
So, sorry.
Yeah, there's a certain smugness that anybody has when you know something that other people don't. And you know something the other people don't, and you also know that they're never going to know it.
Yeah, I'm in the inner circle. I know more than you. Yeah.
Well, and again, I'll put out the fact that I've never belonged to, I'm not a Crowley. I don't belong to any secret societies, and I've never worked for any intelligence agency. And again, if I did, I wouldn't tell you. But nevertheless, I haven't. But in talking to people who have, which is one of the things that I do, you often come up against that, which is that, I could, the old joke, I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you.
Yeah.
Okay. I've never actually had anybody say that, but I've had them say that, I wish I could tell you the rest of it, but I can't. Right? I took an oath to never talk about these things, and that means never.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, I may kind of hint around this, and you can try to draw out of what I'm saying what you think, but I'm not going to tell you whether that's right or wrong. And that's what it is. Again, it's that cult of secrecy. And the secrecy itself, I think, in some ways, almost begins to operate like a drug. That this ability that one has knowledge, and then again compare that to what it is, arguably, that occultism offers. What does every secret society and every mystical order offer? It offers knowledge you can't get anywhere else. Right? You join this organization, you will then learn secrets of the universe, the mysteries of life and death that no one else will have. So that's what, again, I think the thing that really combines intelligence and occultism together is a very, very similar mindset. It's very easy to go to one. One is very translatable to the other one.
Yeah, it's similar to the intelligence community's ties to organized crime.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the same murky world, yeah.
Flexible morality.
Yeah.
People who have skills that you could use. So I think he was probably scouted for this when he was at university. I think probably if they were thinking about sending him on some sort of test run to Russia, the interesting thing is that in 1898, the period he's talking about, Britain and Russia were not friends, they were adversaries. This was before Germany became Britain. And so Russia, kind of like today, was the great sort of enemy of the British Empire. And therefore, sending any kind of diplomatic personnel into Russia almost always entails some degree of intelligence function or vetting, because you are being sent into the sort of enemy territory. But that's probably what he was being given. He was being given some kind of small quasi-diplomatic cover assignment that was in some ways going to test his ability to operate as an asset in a foreign country. Is he going to be caught right away? It's probably something simple. You're going to go in, you're going to meet a couple of people, and you're going to come back and give us a report about what you saw. Or you're just going to walk around and give us a report about what you saw. Remember, the ability to observe and report is also a very key element. Knowing what to look for, knowing who to talk to. And any kind of acquaintance with the occult world, of course, gives you this whole kind of nether world to penetrate. A world, for instance, in which generals or statesmen or ambassadors or dukes or princes or who knows, kings and czars could operate on a different level and where you could learn more things about them. So from that point on, I think Crowley was employed whenever it was thought useful And the book chronicles some of those. The main one, of course, tends to revolve around his appearance in New York aboard the Lusitania on Halloween 1914. Okay, how do you like that? So, see, that's one of those things that I've had people ask me, well, you know, did he plan it that way? Probably not, because the shipping schedules plan things that way. But
On the Lusitania. Ne? Crowley war auf der Lusitania, die dann unterging und den Ersten Weltkrieg auslöste, während der zweite Bush alle Patronen des Ersten Weltkriegs über seinen Schreibtisch verkaufte. Familienbetriebe.
Nevertheless, it's, you know, did he see some portent in that? Possibly. Or maybe it's one of those things. But anyway, it's a curious coincidence, if nothing else. So he arrived in New York, ostensibly, as he describes it in his memoirs, he arrived there on some kind of economic mission. You know, he was going to go there because this was the beginning of the war. The British were trying to put out large business contracts for shells and rifles in New York. Remember, the United States, here again, a little mini history lesson here. The United States did not enter World War I until towards the end. Okay, so the war started in 1914. The U.S. didn't enter until about 3 years later, until April 1917. So prior to that, the United States is a neutral country, but it's a very important neutral country because it has huge industrial capacity and it also has large amounts of money. And so one of the things that really keeps the Allied war effort alive, one of the things that becomes absolutely essential to the British and the French and even the Russian war efforts is getting contracts for weapons and munitions in the United States and also getting loans. The British war effort is literally kept alive by loans brokered by J.P. Morgan and Company. Wall Street is clearly on the Allied side. So it makes sense in some way that that Crowley would go over under some sort of economic cover, but that's not really what he was there for. What he really came to New York for in October 1914 was to track down an Irish revolutionary named Sir Roger Casement. So Sir Roger Casement, again, is one of those people that outside of Irish schoolrooms, most people haven't heard of, but probably should have. Roger Casement, because he was a Sir Roger Casement, he was Irish born, but remember Ireland was part of the British Empire at that time, and he had been for most of his life a loyal servant of the British Crown. In fact, he had served Queen Victoria as a diplomat in Africa and in South America, and he also become a kind of a world-recognized figure because what Casement had done is that he had carried out undercover investigations of colonial abuses in the rubber plantations in the Amazon and in the Congo Basin. And he had discovered all kinds of horrible things.
This was King Leopold's kingdom, right?
Yes, King Leopold. So anybody who knows anything about King Leopold and the Congo knows that it was an incredibly nasty affair. And that's one of the things that Casement's investigation revealed. You know, he literally sort of dug up the dirt on these abuses, and that led to international conferences and international laws to restrict this, the whole stage. So he was fairly well known for his time. But the other thing about Casement is that his study of imperialist abuses also gradually turned him against the very empire that he served. And what he began to do is one of those things that can be kind of dangerous to do when you begin connecting observations you made in one area to another one. And so what Casement did is that he realized that, well, yeah, you know, the Belgians really did horribly misrule the Congo and the Brazilians misrule the Amazon, just like the British misrule Ireland. And so he became an Irish revolutionary, a Fenian. And he became so convinced of this that when war broke out between England and Germany in August 1914, Casement went to New York. He went to this neutral country across the Atlantic where he knew, for instance, that Irish revolutionaries could function freely. Okay. So remember, by this time, by 1914, there were more Irish in America than there were in Ireland. And just like later on, where did all the money for the IRA came from? It came from Boston, it came from Chicago, it came from Irish Americans. So he went there, Casement went to New York to, first of all, make connections with the sort of IRA in New York, but also with German diplomats, okay? People like Franz von Papen and Captain Boy Ed, and even perhaps the German ambassador in Washington, Count von Bansdorf. So he went to a neutral country, which was friendly to Ireland, and he conferred with German diplomatic personnel, and he put a deal before him. He goes, look, England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity, and myself representing the Irish Republican Brotherhood, can you give us money and weapons and advisors to raise rebellion in Ireland? Okay, so keep in mind at that point, no matter how much one may sympathize Roger Casement, he had crossed the line into high treason. He was now, during a time in which the country he was a citizen was at war, was consulting with his representatives in a foreign country to foment rebellion in his homeland. So clearly, there were people in London who wanted to keep track of Roger Casement, or even better yet, put him out of business. So when Crowley left England, when he set sail in the Lusitania from Liverpool, the reports, which he was aware of, was that Casement was still in New York. And so my argument, which I feel pretty firm about, is that what Crowley was really going there to do was to suss out what it was that Casement was doing. That's because from the minute Crowley arrives in New York, he poses as an Irishman. He poses as what? An Irish patriot, which he's not, which he's never been before. I mean, Crowley's not Irish. I don't even think he'd ever been to Ireland. He's about as English as you can get. But he gets off the boat. He tells the U.S. immigration officials that he's Irish, and he starts telling everybody else who will listen to him that he's Irish. Oddly enough, the Irish in New York don't pay much attention to him, but the Germans do.
So he's proving his bona fides with the Germans by claiming he's an Irish nationalist.
Right, he's claiming that's what he's claiming. But the other idea is that would give him access to one of the people, for instance, that he knows meeting, right? In fact, a guy who meets him at the boat, literally, is an Irish American, an important Irish American art dealer and also political figure in New York, a guy by the name of John Quinn. So John Quinn is part of the New York political establishment and well-to-do there. He's well-connected socially in New York, so he can sort of help Crowley on that standpoint. But he's also noted as an Irish patriot, but not as a kind of IRA-style patriot. The other thing about Quinn, and this is what made more sense, I also found out that John Quinn, while being an Irish patriot, also was a regular visitor and informer at the British consulate in New York. In other words, he was a spy for the crown, or at least he supplied them with information. So Crowley comes over in the Lusitania, gets off the boat, is literally met at the dock by someone who is another what? Another British asset spying on the Irish. One of the people that Quinn had had contact with recently was Roger Casement. So he would be the perfect person to give him some idea. What he told Crowley, however, is that Casement had disappeared. He vanished from New York. So this is, when then Crowley notes in his autobiography that, well, I arrived in New York and I found out that my aide was addled. I found out that, what I'd come over for was now that makes no sense if he was there to buy munitions, because that was a going business. It does make sense if his job was to pick up Casement's trail and he showed up only to find that Casement was gone. So this comes back to the question, okay, well, suppose he was doing that, but why would they send Crowley to check up on Casement? Well, remember, Casement's big secret was that he was gay. All right? And remember, this is 1914, and those are the type of things that employ the British government, even if everybody knew about it, you didn't talk about. So Crowley, remember, also claimed to be bisexual, to have some acquaintance with that kind of underworld. So what you needed, if you wanted to track Casement in New York And especially if you wanted to get the dirtiest dirt on him you could, you needed someone who could not just penetrate the Irish underground, but also the homosexual underground, that sort of demi-monde that he would operate. So when you look at it that way, Crowley was someone who had the particular experience, skills, knowledge, and connections that would help it. But so then he had to find something else to do. And what he does is that he turns himself into a German propagandist. He meets a guy named George Sylvester Viereck, who was a German-American editor of the Fatherland, and Viereck hires him to write really scurrilous anti-British propaganda. I mean, there's no getting around that. You know, things where he calls the king a dwarf. And at one point, Crowley writes an article sort of praising German Zeppelins setting London on fire. You know, the type of thing you figure that after the war, when you went back to England, people might have questions about. Okay, I mean, you know, clearly, what Crowley did in New York, what he wrote in New York, if it wasn't treason, it was very, very close to it. He didn't cross the same line that Casement did, but he nonetheless certainly skirted that. The interesting thing to sort of cut ahead is that what repercussions does Crowley ever officially suffer for writing anti-British propaganda? Nothing.
Yeah, it's like
Right.
World War II. There was Lord Haw,
Yeah.
who actually did. I think he did hang.
Yeah.
But he went to Germany and I think did broadcasts. But
Yeah.
But in this case, it might not. Who knows? Maybe Lord Haw was like a triple agent.
You never know.
You never know.
Literally, you never do know. You know, and his whole hanging was fake, and he, you know, lived out his life in some pleasant island off the coast of Scotland.
Yeah.
But that wouldn't be true because there are no pleasant islands off the coast of Scotland. But anyway, so Crowley didn't quite, you know, he was writing German propaganda or anti-British propaganda in a neutral country, but still, you know, yeah. And this was known. This was picked up, and the British press certainly knew about it, and they raised a stink about it when he came home. In the British press, he was denounced as a traitor, but the British government, in fact, in particular, British security and intelligence services, never had a bad thing to say to him about it, and there's a reason for that, because he was doing, as that MID report noted, they knew exactly what he was doing, and he was doing exactly what they wanted him to do.
Yeah, this is part of that compartmentalization you were talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the things is that in the during the war, they always thought he was highly suspicious. And I think that suited other people, especially in the Admiralty's intelligence area, just fine. They wanted to think that about him. I mean, it's part of your credibility. So let's put it this way. If you're trying to infiltrate someone, if you're trying to infiltrate a mole into, let's say, the German propaganda apparatus in New York, which is what he was penetrating, he has to get some way for the Germans to trust him. And really, why should they do that? See, that's the next question. Why would the Germans trust him? Why would they ever take anything that he said seriously, even if he agreed to write propaganda for them?
So, musste kurz Akku anstecken. Krass, dass der von 15% Akku gleich auf 0 springt. Gehen mal ein Stück zurück, 2 Minuten.
You never know.
Literally, you never do know. You know, and his whole hanging was faked, and he, you know, lived out his life in some pleasant island off the coast of Scotland.
Yeah.
But that wouldn't be true because there are no pleasant islands off the coast of Scotland. But anyway, so Crowley didn't quite, you know, he was writing German propaganda or anti-British propaganda in a neutral country.
Gut, an der Stelle stoppen wir jetzt erstmal. und fassen mal kurz zusammen. Vorkoster bei The Rockefeller, Skull and Bones erstes Mitglied, Founding Hitler, Russell Trust, Opium Trade, Brown Brother Harriman, Schmuggel von allen möglichen Dingen, Elm Street, Reagan Attack, CIA-Chef mit der CIA, die Operation die Killer Operation, die Murder Inc., Pegasus, Operation 40, alle Attentate der CIA, Skull and Bones, Al-Qaida, 911, A Million Stars, irgendeine Ansprache hat er auch gehalten, A Million Kinds of Light, oder ich weiß nicht, was er gesagt hat. Dann Union Trust, Blind Trust, Hitler Funding, Warburg, Harvard Trust, CIA-Chef, Attentate, Brown Robber Harriman, Rockefellers Vorkoster. Das alles sind die Bushs, und die Bushs sind aber mit Crowley, mit Barbara und Betty White. Ist wie bei den Maxwells. Bill Gates, sein Papa, Maxwell Gates Papa, hat Planned Parenthood, 43 Millionen Föten pro Jahr in Amerika. Bill Gates hat mit der Finanzierung der Fed Seattle von seiner Mutter Microsoft alle Hardware plus Betriebssystem. Robert Maxwell Super Spy. Robert Maxwell Super Spy. Alle Geheimnisse Amerikas. Alle Geheimnisse. Er wurde so mächtig, dass man ihn umgebracht hat. Er ist Spectre. Ja, das ist Spectre. Ghislaine Maxwell lieferte Kinder an die Eliten. Sie war die Händlerin von Epstein. Epstein war nie wichtig. Sie war die Händlerin. Robert Maxwell, Super Spy, klaute alle Geheimnisse und erfand die Backdoor. Die Hintertür in jede Software. Während Bill Gates Maxwell die Hardware. Plus eine Impfung mit Nanotech zum Anschließen an ein Golem-System. Ja. So, Meta, Facebook, alle Silicon Valley financed by the CIA. Wenn man sich anguckt, welche CIA-Putsche es gab, plus die ganzen Attentate, alle gehen auf die Bushs und die Bush gehen auf Crowley. Crowley geht auf Sabbath Hesseini irgendwann zurück. Und auf Marquis de Sade. Überall, wo der rote Ring auftaucht. Faszinierend. Ich werde demnächst mal ein Special dazu machen. Vielleicht auch heute Abend. Mal gucken. Kein Plan. Bis später.